Hi, I'm Chad with Move for a Guitar. This lesson is from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to talk more about diminished 7th chords. First off, if you like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. This is part 6.14 from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So earlier in this series, we talked about diminished 7th chords when we were talking about building 7th chords. And back then I told you that the diminished 7th chord doesn't come from the major scale. And at this point, we've talked about two places that it's come from: a mode from the harmonic minor scale and from the whole half diminished scale. And the mode from the harmonic minor scale is a very uncommon mode. So the main place you look at it coming from is the whole half diminished scale. And I didn't talk about what I'm going to talk about in this lesson back when we were talking about diminished chords, just because it would have been too much information back then. But now I think it's at a place where you can start grasping the theory behind these chords, a little bit more theory behind these chords. So on your screen you have the diminished 7th chord and its inversions. It's in the key of G. It doesn't matter what key it's in when you're just talking about intervals, but the roots are all on G. So here's root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion. And of course you just move them up in minor thirds and the shape stays the same because they're symmetrical chords. You know all that. We talked about that multiple times. But I wanted to go a little more in depth with diminished 7th chords. So if we were to turn these into the actual notes, we would have G diminished 7th. So that would be G, B flat, D flat, E. Or it could actually be looked at as G, B flat, D flat, F double flat, which is the exact same as E. Something that's important to understand about diminished 7th chords, or any symmetrical chord, but they're different depending on the chord and the distances and the intervals. Obviously you know that diminished 7th chords are all in minor third intervals. That's what makes them symmetrical. So every interval in order is a minor third apart. So G to B flat's minor third, B flat to D flat's a minor third, D flat to E is a minor third. That's what makes these chords symmetrical. That's why you can move them up holding the same shape and just move them up in minor thirds. Another thing that's important to understand about them is that every note in the chord can be the root. So right now I've created the G's as roots. I just made them red, and that would give us G diminished 7th chord and the inversions. But if I made the D flat the root, then I'd have D flat diminished 7th chords and its inversions. Or if I made E the root, I'd have E diminished 7th and its inversions. Or if I made B flat the root, I'd have B flat diminished 7th and its inversions. So any note in the diminished 7th chord can be the root. So if we were to take a G diminished 7th chord, it can be a G diminished 7th chord, but it can also be a D flat diminished 7th chord, an E diminished 7th chord, or a B flat diminished 7th chord. And that's just how the intervals work out. If I was in the key of G, this G would be my root, the D flat would be my flat 5, the E would be my double flat 7, and the B flat would be my flat 3, which are all the intervals of diminished 7th, because obviously these all commemorate diminished 7ths. So that's what the G is a root. But if I made the D flat my root, the D flat would obviously be my root. The E, which could also be an F flat, would be my flat 3. The B flat, which could also be C double flat, would be my double flat 7. And the G, which could also be A double flat, would be my flat 5. And that would be the same if you did it for each one of the notes. If I started on E, you'd still end up with root flat 3, flat 5, double flat 7. And that's why any of the notes in a diminished 7th chord can be the root, because that's how the intervals work out. So that means G, D flat, E, and B flat are all the same chord shape for diminished 7ths. They all share the same notes, so they can all be pretty much the same chord. It's just obviously the intervals relate to the roots differently, but you'd hold the same chord. If I went up and played diminished 7th starting on A flat, you can see I've written those in green and just put them in their inversions of A flat. A flat would be the same chord as D, F, or B diminished 7th, because any one of those notes could be the root as well. Or if I do it one more time and go to A and its inversions, those are all in blue. A diminished 7th shares the exact same notes as E flat diminished 7th, F sharp diminished 7th, and C diminished 7th, because any of the notes from an A diminished 7th can be the root. So that means if you played a diminished 7 starting on G and played its inversions, A flat and played its inversions, and D, A and played its inversions, you've played all the diminished 7 possibilities up and down the fretboard because they all share same notes with these other diminished 7s. So that's something really interesting about a diminished 7th chord, that any of the intervals, any of the notes in the diminished 7th chord can become the root. And you can see that's the same way the diminished scale keys work, because if you played a diminished scale starting on G, you'd also have the B flat, D flat, and E diminished scales. If you played it starting on A flat, you'd also have the B, D, and F diminished scales. And if you played it starting on A, you'd also have the C, E flat, and F sharp diminished scales. So it works the same way. And again, if that's something confusing to you, don't worry, you'll come back to it often. It is something confusing when you first start thinking about this, but over time it'll make sense. And if you really get into using these chords or these scales, it'll just become second nature to understand that. So that's a little bit more about diminished 7th chords. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson, where I'm going to talk about the whole tone scale. And be sure to download the e-guide, all the diagrams are in there, and be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.